Thanks so much for joining. We are building a critical mass of participants and attendees here today, and we'll get underway in just about a minute. Okay, well, thank you so much for joining us. Happy Valentine's Day, happy Black History Month, and we are glad you're with us to discuss what should be an interesting topic over the next hour, and that is our Marine Protected Area Network. This network of protected areas off California's coast that turns 10 years old this year. Just a little bit of context on our discussion today. This discussion is part of what we call the Secretary Speaker Series, which gives us at the Resources Agency an opportunity to elevate priorities, discuss emerging topics, bring thinkers from outside of government in to talk to us about important priorities that we share. You may have tuned in before, and if you haven't, please know we do one of these about every month, and it's a good opportunity to learn a new topic or to go deeper on a topic you may already know. We are meeting for the next, or with you for the next hour over this platform. I'm going to be talking to some really interesting leaders on the topic of marine protected areas. Should you have questions or comments that you want to pose to us, please use your Q&A button on the bottom of the screen, and you can get those questions in, and I'll be facilitating discussion. And also know that we're recording this session, and it will be available on our website after our conversation today. My colleague Geeta is putting informational links in the chat. So as we introduce different speakers, for example, she'll provide some biographical information on the speaker if you want to learn a little bit more about that person. And then also as we bring up different points of information, she'll be providing links. Whole idea is to make this interactive and to give us an opportunity to learn about this topic. So with that said, we will get underway. Let me just give you a preview, though, of who we're going to be talking to today. We'll talk to my colleague, Chuck Bonham, who leads our California Department of Fish and Wildlife. DFW, as we know them, is really integral in the management of marine protected areas. We'll talk to Jen Mendez, who works at the Crystal Cove Conservancy in Southern California as a programs and conservation manager. We'll speak with Dr. Jennifer Dugan, a research biologist at the Marine Science Institute at UC Santa Barbara. Then we'll also talk to Jules Jackson, who's the Outreach and Indigenous Engagement Coordinator at Wild Coast. And also, of course, Jim Webb, a recreational fisherman who is also a volunteer angler with a really important program that we have called the California Collaborative Fisheries Research Program. So what we're doing with these conversations and hearing first from each of these folks and then being in discussion is to really help understand where we stand with marine protected areas after 10 years. So to lay the groundwork for that discussion, I have a few slides that I want to share. And I recognize that many of you may be experts on marine protected areas, but some are only learning about this topic for the first time. So my goal by sharing these slides is to really level set the conversation here today. So first, I would share that California's MPA network is, again, turning 10 this year. At the end of the 10 years period, there has always been the vision of doing a decadal management review. And so a lot of our discussion is really looking back on the last 10 years. The genesis of our MPA network, as we know it, was the Marine Life Protection Act in 1999. That directed our state government to redesign its existing marine protected areas. That initiated a multi-year process that was intended to be based on science, but also driven by community engagement. And I'll be candid, that process to develop MPA networks was effective in many ways, and it included improvements and lessons learned. And so we'll unpack that a little bit more here today. Once established, this network is the first of its kind, really in the world, ecologically connected between 124 specific protected areas. About 16% of our state waters are covered by MPAs. And our state waters go from the beach to 3 miles out. So about 16% of the state waters covered by MPAs. 9% of those protected areas are what are known as fully protected. So no take of any life in those reserves. And then the remainder of the 7% is limited take protected areas. I'm really glad to report that our MPA network is really seen as a global model of marine-based stewardship. And we're hearing about more and more marine protected areas based on California's model around the world. And this is, of course, part of our 30 by 30 effort in California to conserve 30% of our lands and coastal waters by 2030. Next slide. So 124 marine protected areas really all across our California coast. And those 124 areas are unique. Each of them is unique in terms of what it's trying to do and how it interacts with its environment. We provide 3 examples here in the north, in the central coast, and in the south. Russian Gulch State Marine Conservation Area, for example, encompasses 2 rocky headlands and 1 bay, situated between the towns of Fort Bragg and Mendocino. The MPA is full of coves, rock islands, caves, and inlets. Moving south, the Elkhorn Slough by Moss Landing inland from the Monterey Bay is a state marine reserve and a state marine conservation area located in a very large estuary, which is that intermixing between salt and fresh waters. And both of the state marine reserve and its associated marine conservation area protect numerous habitats, tidal mudflats, marshes, eelgrass, and beaches that are very popular with wildlife watchers. And then down south, an example of an MPA is the Laguna Beach State Marine Reserve and the State Marine Conservation Area. And it protects more than 6 square miles of rocky and sandy habitats, including what we know as this rocky intertidal ecosystem and shallow kelp reefs that go out to a depth of almost 1,200 feet. Attracts a lot of ocean users, including surfers, tide poolers, wildlife viewers, scuba, freedivers, kayakers, paddleboarders. So this gives you an understanding of just the diversity of our marine protected areas. Next slide. So over the last 10 years, our agencies have been focused on what we know as a partnership-based approach to MPA management. Yes, we have our departments like our Marine Division of Department of Fish and Wildlife, and they do wonderful work. But we also recognize that there's a lot of different agencies and communities that really figure into the effective management of MPAs. I help to lead what's called a statewide leadership team that is always focused on aligning, coordinating management of these MPAs. And that includes state and federal agencies, our tribes, and our NGO partners. We also have a Marine Collaborative Network, which is a collection of 14 different collaboratives up and down our coast that bring together local voices from California communities and fills an important gap by connecting our state level MPA management with the local communities that know and love their coast. And then, of course, tribal partnerships are key. And the Tribal Marine Stewards Network, which just launched, is a great example of an evolution, a journey to ensure that tribal leaders, governments, and communities can provide leadership over stewarding our coastal and marine resources. Next slide. So where do we stand after 10 years? And that's really the discussion for today. And there, as I mentioned, there's been this decadal independent science review. And as we'll hear from Chuck in just a moment, our department, or I should say our Fish and Game Commission, just heard an overview or a summary of that scientific review. And lots to unpack there. And again, we're going to do that here today. But overall takeaways are some really impressive data suggesting our MPA network is having its intended goal of improving, protecting, restoring the environmental richness of our coast. So this 10-year milestone is important. It's an opportunity to identify what's worked in recent years, where we can improve, what scientific questions continue to exist, and most of all, how they will inform our adaptive management of our MPA network. So that provides a broad overview of our MPA network over the last decade. And I want to bring in my first colleague here to talk to today, and that, of course, is my friend and colleague, Chuck Bonham. Chuck, you and I are in the same building, I think separated by a few floors. I think we'd rather be out there, within an MPA having this conversation, just given how beautiful our coast is. But if you can, for me, just give a broad sense from where you sit, what this MPA network means to California, and importantly, after 10 years, what we know about its effectiveness.
I think, Wade, this network means a lot to Californians. Year after year, no matter political affiliation or where you may live in the state, Californians overwhelmingly show support for the ocean and ocean protection. It's woven into who we are at an identity level for all kinds of different reasons. So 10 years later, I have three main top line takeaways. We have come a long way in 10 years. This network is working. It's actually working. It's doing what a lot of folks thought it might do 10 years ago, and we should be proud about it. So here are some examples of how far we've covered in the 10 plus years. Even more if you look back to the Marine Life Protected Act in 1999. That act didn't really say spend time with tribes consulting on how to weave ecological knowledge and the things our sovereigns know since time immemorial. And where we are today is night and day compared to that start. You mentioned our Tribal Stewards Network. Another example of how far we've come, 14 community collaboratives. This isn't just one state agency now trying to implement. It's a variety of state and federal agencies. More importantly, it's citizens who've organized into citizen science and local community components, all forming actual collaboratives, like a unionization of interest in implementing the MPA. That wasn't the case 10 years ago. We've got signage at over 500 physical locations on the coast about what it means when you interface on the shore with the ocean, and the chance to learn about marine protected areas in the network. So the list goes on of how far the journey has taken us, and it's working. Point number two, it is working. If you take a look at the decadal report, which was recently made available and discussed last week at our sister Fish and Game Commission, which is a fine piece of work, you can find examples of success throughout that entire document. Take one of the most amazing. Bigger fish and more of them inside the protected network than outside. What's not to like about bigger fish and more of them? So abundance and biomass are going up. Another, go ahead.
Well, I was going to say, you're so good at giving the bottom line up front, and it's so important to understand. Can you help us, though, just briefly unpack? You lead the Department of Fish and Wildlife, which I think has some responsibility of the MPAs, and then there's an entity called the Fish and Game Commission.
Yep.
Just as we move forward with adaptive management, can you talk about the difference between the two?
And how they relate to each other, which I think is another example of how far we've come, and this is working. So our department at Fish and Wildlife is charged with implementation, management, the day-to-day. If you as a researcher need a permit to do research within a marine protected area, that's our department. And on that front, 98% of the proposed research projects have been permitted in the time cycle from 2012 to 2022. So about 2,300 permits were issued for work in state marine areas, and about 900 of those for work within marine protected areas. So implementation department, compliance and enforcement department. We've got dedicated in the marine space 50 wildlife officers who live and work on 7 marine patrol vessels. If you're thinking about policy and adaptive management, Fish and Game Commission. It's got 5 members on it, great people who comprise a fantastic commission or board. And over time, what they've been able to do is adaptively manage the network. We've changed boundaries to reflect more specific GPS coordinates. The commission has altered the boundaries of Stewart's Point, SMCA, to accommodate the Kashaya Band of Pomo Indians so that they could do their ancestral practices in the waters offshore. And we've been able to engage through the commission and use its public process. It has a marine resources subcommittee where upcoming in March and then shortly after, the whole decadal review is going to go through a public discussion that's got equity and inclusion and diversity of perspective to talk about the findings of the decadal review. Department implementing, commission kind of managing policy, knitted together for a better outcome.
Chuck, huge appreciation to you for guiding all of that. We're going to bring you into the conversation, back into the conversation in just a moment. But next, I wanted to introduce Jen Mendez. Jen is Programs and Conservation Manager at Crystal Cove Conservancy. And Jen, you are a member of the Orange County MPA Council. So one of the sort of key points of connection between a state agency like Chuck's and local communities that love these areas. Can you talk a little bit about the work you do in your organization and specifically the work to help more people understand the role of MPAs?
Yeah, so the Orange County Marine Protected Area Council is one of the first collaboratives that were started back in 1999. And as you had mentioned, we'd worked to create access and communication with different communities. And one big one that we've been working on recently is improving translations. So there's more access to people who are coming to the coastline. Specifically, one of our projects was to establish a community identified process for translations and messaging review. We also wanted to evaluate MPA translations, messaging, and materials locally, and then essentially to develop a process for CDFW review and approval. And so this was done through hosting focus groups. And so we'd essentially translated, or there's materials that were already translated, but getting them vetted by community members. And so we did 5 different languages. So there's Mandarin, Spanish, Korean, Vietnamese, and Tagalog.
That's amazing. And so how does the Orange County Council sort of figure into the other community collaboratives across the state? And what does success look like within these collaboratives?
Yeah, so I'd say success looks like getting people involved. So it's bridging, the local community members with our, people from the state. So it's making sure that it's not just top to down, but also bottom up. And then it's also thinking about stewardship and conservation on like a landscape scale, meaning we can't just really focus on one particular area, which is the importance of having these, a bunch of this different collaborations. So it's like the main message is basically how can we get everybody to work together instead of just focusing on one area? Like we can't do this work alone. It's, it's a lot, but if we all work together, then we'll be successful.
Yeah, and it's been so cool in the handful of MPAs that I've visited to have community members actually aware of the boundaries of the marine protected area and how it interacts. And there's a real sense of ownership. Some folks even refer to these as underwater parks.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So a big one is just, it's having like that consistent messaging too, up and down the coastline. So there's like no confusion in that area.
Yeah. Well, thanks so much, Jen. We're going to bring you back into the conversation in a little bit. I next wanted to introduce Dr. Jennifer Dugan. And Dr. Dugan, as I mentioned earlier, is a research biologist, Marine Science Institute at UC Santa Barbara. And Dr. Dugan was really important central researcher monitoring the effects of MPAs on one ecosystem, which is sandy beaches, and then also played a leadership role in the scientific working group that synthesized, brought together monitoring results across multiple ecosystems. So Dr. Dugan, you have the unenviable task of breaking down a lot of complicated science in ways that people like me can understand. What are some key takeaways, or what would you say as a scientist that's been deeply involved in understanding how MPAs have performed? How would you share the summaries of the Decadal Review?
Thanks, Wade. Yeah, that's a big question, but I will do what I can. I think one point I want to make just at the onset is that we really have, the state has supported a remarkable monitoring effort as well as a remarkable network of MPAs. And I think the monitoring effort could also be elevated in our discussions, because the reason we have the information we have in our hands today for the Decadal Review is because of all these scientists, doing this long-term monitoring all over the state. So I think just as a scientist, those things are really achievements for science and for the state to have that kind of information at our fingertips, and for us to synthesize and for us to compare across habitats. It's just incredible. I can think of no other situation like that as a scientist. So I commend the state on that. So we know that California's MPAs are as many varieties as you can think of. Any ecologist or scientist worth their salt can find differences between any two patches of water on the planet. So we know there's a lot of variety in size and age and fishing history, habitat composition, ocean conditions that the MPAs are subject to, disturbance, all those things. So lots and lots of variety. And so not surprisingly, we find a lot of variety in MPA responses across the network, quite a wide variety. So, species vary, regions, quite a bit of variation among regions, and that may have to do with fishing pressure and also MPA ages. But overall, as Chuck said, it's working. We are seeing a number of species, both fish and invertebrates, that are responding to MPAs in the way that you would predict from protection from fishing. And this is, they're larger, they have higher numbers, and in particular, fish that are targeted by both recreational and commercial fisheries tend to have higher biomass in MPAs across the state. We do, however,
Biomass means they're bigger, they're fatter?
It means if you added up all the fish, that tonnage would be greater in an MPA. So biomass means sort of collectively,
Got it.
Population biomass means take, 30 fish and each one weighs a pound and you've got 30 pounds. So
Got it.
that's the biomass. So biomass has been one of the kind of response variables that's shown, at least overall, statewide, for fish, that there's a strong signal. But a lot of that signal, it turns out, is coming from the South Coast. And when we look through all the different habitats, kelp forests, rocky reefs, all these different habitats, beaches, the South Coast is sort of coming up as having stronger signals. So that's something we're really interested in, kind of understanding why that would be. And one of the factors appears to be the age of MPAs. Another factor that it seems to be important in sort of the magnitude of these MPA effects is the fishing history. So if the area around the MPA is heavily fished, or fishing pressure, you might see a stronger MPA signal inside those MPAs. Whereas if it's kind of even inside and outside the MPA in terms of fishing pressure, you would see less of an MPA effect. So there's lots and lots of things to kind of unpack, as you say.
Yeah. And Dr. Dugan, if you talk about the age of the MPAs, important to note that it's not like all 124 MPAs started on the same date.
Exactly.
So does that mean that some of the MPAs in the South Coast are older, and so therefore there may have been more time for those benefits to accrue?
Yes, exactly. Yeah, time is important. And as time accrues, this is just the first 10 years, and some of these species live much longer than 10 years. And their population cycles, 10 years might just be a blip for them. So the fact that we're seeing these types of responses across the network and for a variety of species, and every single one of the habitats we looked at saw some sort of positive response to MPAs, whether it be biodiversity or fish size or invertebrate size, which is to me a very remarkable result and really, really something to be, impressed with as a network that beaches, kelp forests, reefs, you're seeing some sort of MPA response. And that's a wide variety of habitats that are looked at, to great
Absolutely.
depths. Yeah.
And boy, what an ambitious undertaking to do a scientific review of the impact of 124 different places, connected but different places.
Right.
So that begs the question, what scientific questions remain? As a scientist and within your community, what questions do you think we need to continue to ask and answer?
Well, I think we need to continue, particularly given the sort of climate variation that we're seeing in the state, both in the ocean and on land. We really need to continue to monitor these MPAs to understand how these responses are going to be modified by climate forcing and climate variation. So I think continuing the long-term monitoring is a really important question. And then, as I was alluding to, unpacking the factors that result in the MPAs having sort of different responses, or different regions having different responses. So the central and south region tend to have stronger MPA responses than the north region. Trying to understand what is underlying those, I think, are really important questions for the future.
Yeah. And of course, none of this happens in a laboratory, right? We're studying a changing system.
Right.
And I serve on the Ocean Protection Council, and it's remarkable just how climate is impacting the ocean and how we are, still understanding that impact.
Yeah.
Well, listen, I'm excited to integrate you into the conversation here in a little bit. We're going to go to our next panelist, and that is Jules Jackson. Jules works for Wild Coast as Outreach and Indigenous Engagement Coordinator. And Jules, as I bring you on, great to see you. Wanted to ask you, so, what is your focus? What is your organization's focus? And really, where have we got it right as it relates to community engagement, but also importantly, engagement with tribal governments and communities? And where do we still have work to do?
Thanks so much, sir. I think that in terms of tribal engagement, we already had Chuck's admission that we were flawed initially. So at least if we're starting from the bottom, we can only go up. One of the things that I do is I work specifically with engaging Indigenous youth. So we're preparing them to be our next generations of ocean conservationists and coastal stewards and working in coastal management. So that's an action item that I'm dedicated to personally, as well as within our organization.
That's really helpful. And so what does community engagement look like if it's successful to you? I mean, what do you've got state policymakers, you have a range of folks. We have several hundred people as part of this. What do you want our takeaway to be as it relates to both tribal engagement and community engagement?
I think we need to start thinking about how do we return tribal rights and ownership of coastal management sources to the tribes themselves. Like you mentioned, we have the Tribal Marine Stewards Network. We also have the Tribal Marine Collaborative. We have systems in place for leadership, and we need to invest in those equitable pathways on a tangible action item that needs to come from funding. We need to fund sustainable opportunities so that we can create these positions for the long term. I mentioned before that I coach youth. I have approximately 15-year-olds. Where we are at this particular decadal, in this part of the decadal management review, they're 15, in 10 years are going to be 25. So do we want to invest in them now or wait until they're 25? Obviously, I'm going to advocate for the former. In terms of underserved communities, it's a very similar philosophy. I think that we need to go beyond cursory engagement and commit to active, ongoing, and evolving partnership if we expect support of MPAs and MPA success. We must continue investing in community partner hybrid management roles with people from the communities. And like I said, provide equitable pathways for those who have interest in becoming MPA managers.
Yeah, absolutely. Just to share a couple of points from where I sit, one is just the importance of restoring tribal leadership to marine management. We've talked about this Tribal Marine Stewards Network, and it's really all about recognizing that our indigenous communities are the original stewards of these resources. And while yes, state government and federal government have a role to play, we're going to be better off if tribal leaders, lead that management over time. And so we're excited to start to institutionalize that. And I think that's going to be, the journey for the next 10 years. So then when we're looking back 10 years from now, it looks very different than it does even today. And then at the end of the day, this is a network of areas that are community serving. Yes, they serve the environment, but they also serve communities. And so they have to work for communities. And we want communities to champion them and feel ownership too. So to your point, really investing resources in that local stewardship and that local education is critical. And for where I sit, it helps the network, maintain its durability because it's relevant to more people across the state. So I appreciate that.
Absolutely. And, there's an indigenous principle of 7 generations. So that you can look at that as 7 generations from now or 3 generations forward, 3 generations back in our current generation. But either way, we need to make sure that investment is there for the future.
Absolutely. Thanks, Jules. We'll be back as a group in just a little bit. Finally, last but certainly not least, I wanted to introduce Jim Webb. And as I said at the top of our discussion, Jim is a recreational fisherman and he's a volunteer angler with a program that helps us monitor MPAs by going out there and actually understanding what's in the water. It's called the California Collaborative Fisheries Research Program. So Jim, obviously anglers, the fishing sector, big part of this discussion around what makes sense on protected areas. But first, maybe just share your own perspective as somebody who gets out on the water and how you've been engaged in this monitoring and management.
All right. Well, thank you very much. Thank you for the opportunity to be here and to talk about this important subject. I've been fishing here on the Central Coast for the last 35, 40 years and have seen a lot of changes. And I have to say that I think the state of California has done a remarkable job of trying to organize the nearshore environment into marine protected areas and state marine conservation areas, and has organized the entire network through the development of the Nearshore Fishery Management Plan that also came out in the late 90s. And I was president of a recreational fishing club in Cambria, California, and became active during the Marine Life Protection Act implementation on the Central Coast. And that effort went through 2007. And then I volunteered to become an angler to go out and help evaluate and monitor performance within marine protected areas in the Central Coast. And I've been doing that for the last 15 years. And I can report from, I don't know, dozens of trips every year, both in marine protected areas and adjacent areas, at least here in the Central Coast. There's been some dramatic changes that have occurred within the MPAs. And as Mr. Bonham pointed out, the vast majority show increased size of fish and increased numbers of fish, increased varieties of fish. And for a recreational fisherman, it is singing my tune. I like these kind of results. And when you volunteer and go out there with the CCFRP, it's a wonderful opportunity for people to learn what's happening in an MPA and to see what kind of progress is being made. I think it might be worth pointing out too that it's exciting to see more fish, bigger fish, et cetera. But the fact of the matter is, it's kind of like stocks, they don't all go up and they don't all go up forever. So I'm sure we will see species that decline
Mhm.
and species that move and so on. But the important thing is you have areas where you can measure what's happening because you've eliminated a lot of things, a lot of activities that detract from the information you're trying to get.
Absolutely. And I'm just curious, because I'm a super amateur angler myself. What do you mostly fish for down there?
Well, I'm not exactly a talented game fisherman. I fish for rockfish, and there's, I don't know, maybe 80 species of rockfish along our coast. And as far as I'm concerned, they're all delicious. And I enjoy catching them and I enjoy releasing them. That's part of the pleasure of being out on the CCFRP activity, is you can see fish released without being harmed and still enjoy the activity of fishing.
Yeah. So Jim, one thing we need to continue to ensure is that those fishing, either for recreational purposes or their livelihoods, have a voice in this. And, to be candid, there have been significant concerns among some fishermen around the establishment of the MPAs. My understanding is that Decatur Review is along with additional monitoring, is really understanding what are the impacts on fisheries. And at least at a high level, at least some of the data on landings, on fishing, on what's caught, suggests that there not necessarily been those negative impacts, but we're still hearing from anglers around the impacts from what they actually perceived prior to MPAs. So how best to ensure that anglers are actually part of this conversation and that they're not left out of the discussion? Because particularly if you're making your livelihood as a commercial fisherman, a fisherwoman, it's a big deal.
Yeah, understandably so. And during the implementation of the MLPA, the Central Coast, the primary concern was potential economic damage done to commercial fishermen or businesses that rely on recreational fishermen. And I think you can say now, it was implemented in 2007 along this stretch of coast. Since then, the information I've seen seems to indicate that the economies have improved, that landing poundage has increased, the cost per pound has gone up. And that argument, as far as I'm concerned, is kind of settled at this point. And we're looking at other opportunities to improve the network that we have established already.
That's really good to hear. And, that monitoring will continue to be important, not only the environmental or biological impact of the MPAs, but also just understanding economic impact. And in some cases, positive recreational impacts where more people are actually getting out in these areas. So if I could, let's bring us all into the conversation and all on screen. We've got a bunch of questions coming in. We're joined by over 400 people here today. And so if you're one of those folks that is tuning in and you have a question or a comment, please click on that Q&A button at the bottom of your screen and ask your question. So one set of questions around something that's developed here in recent years, and that is this big kelp die-off, which I understand has resulted in part from a proliferation of a type of urchin that have created these urchin barrens and gone after kelp. So one question around, has a Decatur Review considered this impact, and are places with MPAs that are experiencing this better off than places without MPAs? Difficult to unpack, but maybe I'd ask Dr. Dugan to start, or Chuck to jump in. Important to understand. Chuck, you want to go?
I'll say, just for point of process, a well-discussed, continually discussed issue in front of our Fish and Game Commission and at our commission's Marine Resources Subcommittee. I think the department and most folks realize we have a tragedy playing out in our kelp forests, and active intervention is one of the tools we're trying to move towards. I will also say, though, when you look at the MPAs, resiliency to me is a bright spot where we need more of Dr. Duggan's work scientifically. If you look just at the Central Coast, you can see some indications that the kelp forest, the rocky intertidal, the mid-depth rocky reefs had some recovery relative to the marine heat wave that didn't show up in other habitat types in the MPA. That's super promising if MPAs translate into a climate resiliency marine heat wave. I think we need more work there. Doctor, over to you.
Yeah, I agree. We need more work. We really have 10 years, which includes one marine heat wave. So the preliminary results are promising that MPAs, especially as they recover further and, you know, build populations, will be places that will be more resilient to some of the climate forcing. And that was particularly true on the Central Coast, and some of the rockfish came back more quickly, as you said, Chuck. So there are definitely some, and kelp is considered to be more resilient in Southern California. That's not where we're having the big urchin problem, but through the heat wave. So there are a lot of promising signs that these MPAs will be both resistant, I think is another word to think about in terms of resilience, that they will sort of hold back the tide of climate change and be more resilient, recover more quickly. And I think those are things we need to think about with things like these urchin, which is like an urchin wave, essentially, that, you know, how will they recover from this? And do you have to intervene, or can the natural processes in a place like an MPA actually allow things to recover on their own? So there's a lot of questions there, more questions than answers.
Yeah, and I'm really proud of our Ocean Protection Council and the team that works there. You know, instead of sitting back on their hands and really looking at this crisis of the widespread loss of kelp, they funded some sort of hands-on research to identify different techniques of removing the purple urchin and how the kelp was faring. So it was sort of like you know, scientific research in real time. We're all committed to doing what we can to restore those incredible kelp forests. Described to me once as the sort of the, you know, it's like if we lost our redwoods, you know, overnight underwater, it's just people don't see it. And that's a major challenge. So question coming in around the difference between the success of MPAs that are no-take areas and those that are limited take areas. And maybe just for everybody, how were some areas designated as no take, in other words, no fishing or collecting, and some limited take? Maybe I'll start with you, Chuck. Why is there this different color of MPAs?
Yeah, there I think you jump in your Wayback Machine and you travel back to the process that many people went through that are participating, of the 400 folks. And you had this lengthy public process, which admittedly didn't have all the right voices fully engaged. And they came up with a set of things with a variety of designations, and that went through basically the Fish and Game Commission's rulemaking. And rules were produced that identified location and conservation measure level, take, no take. I mean, that's the process. That's what happened. And that's what set each of the designations across the whole network per place.
That's really helpful. And Dr. Dugan, any initial take in terms of how limited take versus no take MPAs have succeeded, or is it just too diverse a set of areas to analyze in those groupings?
It's a pretty diverse set of areas to get a cogent answer from right now. We have some of our monitoring design, you know, the monitoring designs do include the SMCAs and the SMRs, but the regulations vary so much among the SMCAs, and hopefully Chuck can back me up on this, you know. For instance, I'm using things that are complete for the beaches. Shore fishing is allowed, so it's an SMCA, but the rest of the habitats are completely protected. So, you know, it's a very mixed bag, so it's difficult to pull the pieces out. But we are seeing in Southern California for the SMCAs and the SMRs, the SMRs are performing better than the SMCAs for some of the surf zone fish.
And SMRs, remind us, stand for? the no take?
Completely no take, yeah, yeah. So at some of the older reserves like Doom Cove and Laguna and Scripps, you know, the SMCAs are not performing as strongly as the SMRs, as those reserves I named.
So
So
one
that's just a snapshot, yeah.
and why it's just a snapshot with a plug for the future. So we've come a long way, but you know, we have a long way to go. Science at its heart just uncovers the next question to try to go answer. So for those who haven't read it or have already read it, go reread Chapter 6 of the Decadal Review and Appendix A. Appendix A is a compilation of every kind of input pathway recommendations, what to do next. So any voice that took the time to kind of offer a what should we do. And Chapter 6 is a distillation of what the department thinks are some of the top tier to-dos. And within both of those is this question: how do you figure out what level of production is producing what kind of result?
That's helpful. Hey, real basic question. Rachel asked, how does an area come to be designated as an MPA? And maybe I'll piggyback on that. And what is the plan for considering, adjustments to the MPA network, changes to the MPA network, or even, expansion of the MPA network, given these findings? Chuck, how would you answer that question? That first and second question.
That is a compound question. I mentioned a moment ago the Title 14 rulemaking process in front of the Fish and Game Commission. That's how you create an area. And that's how the current ones were created. And that was really based on a bunch of design, science, stakeholder recommendations, feasibility. We have made changes using our Fish and Game Commission, again, 5 awesome people who have public process as part of their purpose. And we've changed boundaries. We've moved boundaries to accommodate tribal needs or public infrastructure dynamics. Last question, should we have more of them? That, I think, is going to be a discussion that plays out in the coming weeks and months or years. What I find most curious, though, is what Jim mentioned. The conventional wisdom in the angling community has been, this is a bad idea. I think the Decadal Review is helping us understand it might be conventional, but it doesn't sound like that's a wise position. There's enough in that Decadal Review, in my judgment, to indicate if you have a lived experience like Jim on the water, catch rate, economies, harvest satisfaction all look like they're in improving state, not the earlier conventional wisdom that this would be an anathema to fishing in the ocean. We've got a lot of stuff to work through with our communities, but I think that's the way I'd ask everyone to come to the conversation objectively.
That's really helpful. And I'll invoke the Ocean Protection Council again to say that the OPC, as we know it, is getting ready to fund additional scientific monitoring and research so where there are scientific questions that still need to be answered, there's going to be ongoing scientific research, and it's going to inform questions like adaptive management, like how do we change the network, like if, and where we would grow the network. So that's really helpful. Question about offshore wind, because that's the issue. That's an issue du jour. And how do MPAs interact with offshore wind? I'll briefly touch on that. So California and the federal government are pursuing offshore wind as a really important piece of the puzzle towards moving to 100% clean energy in California. It's an incredible resource. And so we and the federal government have worked to identify areas of the coast where offshore wind may be appropriate. Important to note that the so-called call areas, or these areas that are going to be considered for offshore wind, are very far off our coast, beyond 20 miles. And these marine protected areas are within 3 miles of the shore because they're state waters. So, right now the state's vision for offshore wind, which is really not visible from the shore or barely visible from the shore, does not conflict with our MPA network, either its current state or any future state, because that marine protected area network is simply in closer. More broadly, though, there's an active discussion around understanding what potential impacts could be of offshore wind, both on ecology and the biology of the animals that use those parts of the ocean, as well as, fishing and commercial interests. And part of the review that's taking place right now is to really understand what potential impacts could be, so that those proposed, wind projects eventually can seek to avoid or minimize or even mitigate the impacts that offshore wind has to the coast. Want to get Jen, you into the conversation. What does success? Somebody's asking, okay, well, what does this all mean for the future? As somebody who lives and breathes a set of MPAs in Southern California, what does success look like for you in coming years with the communities you work with?
I think success is just, sorry, am I frozen?
No, you're good.
We're good. Okay. I think success is just reducing barriers of access and inclusion. I think it's the continued collaboration of these MPAs, getting everybody on board, increasing our outreach and education is super huge. And that's also getting people educated before they even come to the coastline, right? So it's how can we expand our resources and meet people with where they at?
Yeah, that's really helpful. That's something we're committed to, but it's only going to work through folks and organizations like yours that are on the ground that help us understand what we have to do. Jules, what does success look like for you? If we're here in another 10 years, well, a few of us won't be here. I won't be in this position in 10 years, but what will we be talking about in 10 years if we're successful?
Chuck spoke about conventional wisdom, which I would expand to include traditional ecological knowledge. As we all know, climate change demands an all hands on deck approach, which includes a long-term strategy that both equalizes and centers traditional ecological knowledge while taking data sovereignty into consideration. So to me, success looks like land back, success looks like MPA name reclamation, and ultimately success looks like representation in all the positions we're in. I always speak to wanting to work my way out of a job. So success for me looks like in 10 years, having one of my students take my role and be on a panel just like this.
Yeah, that's so powerful. And that's something we're working at across our agency. And I know Chuck at the Department of Fish and Wildlife, same. We need a workforce that reflects this incredible diversity in California. And we need people that are impacted by our decisions to actually be in these decision-making positions. So I want to conclude with, Chuck.
Just last week, our Fish and Game Commission, I think, led the participants in a smart and correct discussion. We know some of the feedback on the decadal report is we might be overemphasizing the voice of fishing communities at the expense of a pathway for other coastal voices to play into the decadal review. We hear that. We're working through how to handle the upcoming workshop in March and symposium and then subsequent Fish and Game Commission meetings to deal with that, fair input on equity and inclusion.
That's really, really helpful. So question about I want to bring this into a bit of more of a global dimension as we round out our conversation. One question about the fact that the state has pursued what is an accreditation by the International Union for the Conservation of Nature. And specifically, it's called the Green List, which is an international recognition of a very high standard of environmental protection, almost like an established model that others around the world can emulate. Jim, I think you've been a little bit involved in this. Can you talk about, why some of us have been pursuing this, designation on the Green List?
Yes, I'd be happy to. I participate as a member of their expert assessment team that's trying to walk the 124 site California network through the Green List process. And we've taken it through the application phase, the candidacy phase, and we are now some 4 years into it, going through the verification phase where we actually take experts from different areas and assign them to areas they're not familiar with and make them go out and verify the details that have been reported about the MPA to make sure that they're all as reported. And it's really a great opportunity if we can get the recognition of the green list. I mean, it's not just an opportunity to get recognized, it's an opportunity to learn from other people in other countries what kinds of issues they're dealing with and how they've solved them, if they have.
Absolutely. And we want to be a model to other countries while we continue to learn. And I remember I was at an international conference a couple of years ago when I actually learned from some indigenous leaders in Pacific Islands that they have a very sophisticated set of marine protected areas that goes back hundreds, thousands of years. And in fact, they have different words in their language for different types of closures, whether it's seasonal closure or rotating geographical closure. So there's so much that we can learn and share with others. Want to give anybody who cares to the final word in this hour-long discussion, and that is what makes you hopeful as we have this Decado review before us, and we're interpreting and understanding it and engaging with the public about it. What makes you hopeful in this conversation?
Could I make a comment?
Please.
It's given me hope that a recreational fishery in the near shore is sustainable. And rather than going through generation after generation of cuts and takeaways and so on, that a good, fun recreational experience could be had and maintained in perpetuity.
Thank you, Jim. Others? Jules, Jenny, Jen, Dr. Dugan.
I'll jump in. I think for me as a scientist, it's given me hope that results from a wide variety of habitats can come up with complementary and results that are really, kind of saying the same thing about, if you look, and this is kind of encouraging everyone, kind of a last pitch, the variety of results that these different habitat for MPA signals that we see from all these different habitats are just so important and so interesting. And as I said, highly varied. But the fact that when you pull it all together, you can start to see these large themes emerge is really gives me hope for the future, that this managing our marine resources with MPAs is really the right path.
Thank you for that. Jules or Jen?
Here you go. I would just say, like, conversations like this, I keep going back to collaboration, but I mean, just looking back at the work that we've accomplished from the past 10 years, how we're getting, local governments, nonprofits, tribal members, researchers, fishermen, other community members, how we're all coming together to kind of work on this one big problem and like protect this, special area, I think is huge. And it's exciting to see what work we can do in the future.
Thank you, Jen. Jules, you'd take yourself off mute if you have any final thoughts.
I was gonna nail on collaboration, but since Jennifer hit that and did such a great job explaining that, I'll leave us maybe with a quote that we don't inherit the earth from our ancestors, we borrow it from our children. So what makes me hopeful is always working with the youth, and I hope that they can have a role in this process moving forward. And we're doing a great job of being inclusive and collaborating. I would just add the youth to that as well.
Well, what a fitting end to our discussion. Huge thanks to each of you for not only joining us, but all the work that you've done on MPAs. James, let's move to the last slide. And as we move to the last slide, I'll mention my colleague Gita has put in the chat important information, including an upcoming deeper dive into the Decado review that Chuck and others have mentioned. So if you want to be part, if you want to provide more input or learn more about this, there's a deeper dive forum coming up here in coming weeks. And as always, if you have questions or comments for us, please email us, including if there are topics that you'd like us to do a similar conversation about here in coming weeks and months. Huge thanks for tuning in, for the work you may be doing on this topic or so many others. And once again, happy Valentine's Day and Black History Month. We'll see you again soon.